Chapter 43 of Phoebe Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The conflict. The day which had intervened between Phoebe's morning walk and this darkling flight along the same road had been full of agitation at the house of the Tozers. Phoebe, who would willingly have spared her lover anything more than the brief intercourse which was inevitable with her relations, could find no means of sending him away without breakfast. She had escaped from him accordingly, weary as she was, to make arrangements for such a meal as she knew him, even in his most sentimental mood, to love, a thing which required some time and supervision, though the house was always plentifully provided. When she had hastily bathed her face and changed her dress, she came back to the room where she had left him, to find him in careless conversation with Tozer, who, only half recovered from the excitement of last night, but much overawed by a visit from so great a personage, had managed to put aside the matter which occupied his own thoughts, in order to carry on a kind of worship of Clarence, who was the son of the richest man he had ever heard of, and consequently appeared to the retired butterman a very demigod. Clarence was yawning loudly, his arms raised over his head in total indifference to Tozer, when Phoebe came into the room, and the old man seized upon the occasion of her entrance to perform another act of worship. "Ah, here's Phoebe at last. Mr. Cophead's come in from the country, my dear, and he's going to make us proud, he is, by accepting of a bit of breakfast. I tell him it's a wretched poor place for him as has palaces at his command, but what we can give him is the best quality, that I answers for, and you're one as knows how things should be, even if we ain't grand ourselves." "Have you palaces at your command, Clarence?" she said with a smile. Notwithstanding the fatigue of the night, the fresh air and her ablutions and the agitation and commotion of her mind made Phoebe almost more animated and brilliant than usual. Her eyes shone with the anxiety and excitement of the crisis, and a little, too, with the glory and delight of success, for though Clarence Copperhead was not very much to brag of in his own person, he still had been the object before her for some time back, and she had got him. And yet Phoebe was not mercenary, though she was not in love with her heavy lover in the ordinary sense of the word. She went towards him now, and stood near him, looking at him with a smile. He was a big, strong fellow, which is a thing most women esteem, and he was not without good looks, and he would be rich, and might be thrust into a position which would produce both honor and advantage, and lastly, he was her own, which gives even the most indifferent article a certain value in some people's eyes. Palaces? I don't know, but nice enough houses, and you know you like a nice house, Miss Phoebe. Here, I haven't said a word to the old gentleman. Tell him I ain't come all this way for nothing. You've always got the right words at your finger's end. Tell him, and let's get it over. I think I could eat some breakfast, I can tell you, after that drive." "Grandpapa," said Phoebe, slightly tremulous, "Mr. Copperhead wishes me to tell you that. Mr. Copperhead wishes you to know why." "Bless us!" cried Clarence with a laugh. "Here is a beating about the bush. She has got her master, old gentleman, and that is what she has never had before. Look here, I'm going to marry Phoebe. That's plain English without any phrases, and I don't know what you could say to better it. Is breakfast ready? I've earned it for my part." "Going to marry Phoebe?" Tozer gasped. He had heard from his wife that such a glory was possible, but now, when it burst upon him, the dazzling delight seemed too good to be true. It thrust the forgery and everything out of his head, and took even the power of speech from him. He got up and gazed at the young people, one after the other, rubbing his hands with a broad grin upon his face. Then he burst forth all at once in congratulation. "God bless you, sir. God bless you both. It's an honor as I never looked for. Rising in the world is never no thought of mine. Doing your duty and trusting to the Lord is what I've always stood by, and it's been rewarded. But she's a good girl, Mr. Copperhead. You'll never regret it, sir. She's that good and that sensible as I don't know how to do without her. She'll do you credit, however grand you may make her, and if it's any comfort to you, as she's connected with them as knows how to appreciate a gentleman," said Tozer, breaking down in his enthusiasm, his voice sinking into a whisper in the fullness of his heart. "Grandpapa," said Phoebe, feeling sharply pricked in her pride with a momentary humiliation. "There are other things to be thought of," and she gave him a look of reproach which Tozer did not understand, but which Clarence did vaguely. Clarence, for his part, liked the homage, and was by no means unwilling that everybody should perceive his condescension, and what great luck it was for Phoebe to have secured him. He laughed, pleased to wave his banner of triumph over her, notwithstanding that he loved her. He was very fond of her, that was true, but still her good fortune in catching him was, for the moment, the thing most in his thoughts. "Well, old gentleman," he said, "you ain't far wrong there. She is a clever one. We shall have a bad time of it with the governor at first, for, of course, when there's no money and no connections, a man like the governor, that has made himself, ain't likely to be too well pleased." "As for money, Mr. Copperhead, sir," said Tozer with modest pride, "I don't see as there's anything to be said against Phoebe on that point. Her mother before her had a pretty bit of money, though I say it as shouldn't." "Ah, yes, yes," said Clarence, "to be sure, but a little bit of coin like that don't count with us. The governor deals in hundreds of thousands. He don't think much of your little bits of fortunes. But I don't mind. She suits me down to the ground, does Phoebe, and I don't give that for the governor," cried the young man valiantly. As for Phoebe herself, it is impossible to imagine anyone more entirely put out of her place, and out of all the comfort and satisfaction of her own initiative which she generally possessed, than this young woman was, while these two men talked over her so calmly. It is doubtful whether she had ever been so set aside out of her proper position in her life, and her nerves were overstrained and her bodily strength worn out, which added to the sense of downfall. With almost a touch of anger in her tone, she, who was never out of temper, interrupted this talk. "I think breakfast is ready, Grandpapa. Mr. Clarence Copperhead wants some refreshment after his exertions, and in preparation for the exertions to come. For I suppose your papa is very likely to follow you to Carlingford," she added, with a low laugh, turning to her lover. "I know Mr. Copperhead very well, and I should not like my first meeting with him after I have thwarted all his views." "Phoebe, you don't mean to desert me, by Jove! I'll face him and 20 like him if you'll only stand by me," he cried, which was a speech that made amends. She suffered him to lead her into breakfast less formally than is the ordinary fashion, and his hand on her trim waist did not displease the girl. No, she understood him, knew that he was no great things, but yet he was hers, and she had always meant him to be hers, and Phoebe was ready to maintain his cause in the face of all the world. The breakfast was to Clarence's taste, and so was the company, even old Tozer, who sat with his mouth agape in admiration of the young potentate, while he recounted his many grandeurs. Clarence gave a great deal of information as to prices he had paid for various things, and the expenses of his living at Oxford and elsewhere, as he ate the kidneys, eggs, and sausages with which Phoebe's care had heaped the table. They had no pâté de foie gras, it is true, but the simple fare was of the best quality, as Tozer had boasted. Mrs. Tozer did not come downstairs to breakfast, and thus Phoebe was alone with the two men, who suited each other so much better than she could have hoped. The girl sat by them languidly, though with a beating heart, wondering, as girls will wonder sometimes, if all men were like these, braggarts and believers in brag, worshippers of money and price. No doubt young men too marvel when they hear the women about them talking across them of chiffons, or of little quarrels and little vanities. Phoebe had more brains than both of her interlocutors put together, and half a dozen more added on, but she was put down and silenced by the talk. Her lover for the moment had escaped from her. She could generally keep him from exposing himself in this way, and turn the better side of him to the light, but the presence of a believer in him turned the head of Clarence. She could not control him any more. "A good horse is a deuced expensive thing," he said. The governor gave a cool 150 for that mare that brought me over this morning. He bought her from Sir Robert, but he didn't know, Phoebe, the use I was going to put her to. If he'd known, he'd have put that 150 in the sea rather than have his beast rattled over the country on such an errand. Here he stopped in the midst of his breakfast and looked at her admiringly. But I don't repent, he added. I'd do it again tomorrow if it wasn't done already. If you stand by me, I'll face him, and 20 like him, by Jove. You don't say nothing, said her grandfather. I wouldn't be so ungrateful. Gentlemen like Mr. Copperhead ain't picked up at every roadside. They ain't, by Jove, said Clarence. But she's shy, that's all about it, he added tenderly. When we're by ourselves, I don't complain. Poor Phoebe, she smiled a dismal smile and was very glad when breakfast was over. After that, she took him into the garden, into the bright morning air, which kept her up, and where she could keep her Clarence in hand and amuse him, without allowing this revelation of the worst side of him. While they were there, Martha admitted the visitor of yesterday, Mr. Simpson, from the bank, bringing back to Phoebe's mind all the other matter of which it had been full. Don't you think you ought to go and see about the horse and the dog-cart? She said suddenly, turning to her lover with one of those sudden changes which kept the dull young man amused. You don't know what they may be about. They can't be up to much, said Clarence. Thank you, Miss Phoebe. I like you better than the mare. But you can't be here all day, and I can't be here all day, she said. I must look after Grandmama, and you ought to go down and inquire after poor Mr. May. He is so ill. I have been there all night, helping Ursula. You ought to go back and ask for him. People don't forget all the duties of life because a thing of this sort has happened. Because they've popped and been accepted, said graceful Clarence. By Jove, I'll go. I'll tell young May. I'd like to see his face when I tell him the news. You may look as demure as you like, but you know what spoons he has been upon you, and the old fellow too. Made me jealous as King Lear sometimes, cried the happy lover, with a laugh. He meant Othello, let us suppose. Nonsense, Clarence, but go, please go. I must run to Grandmama. Mr. Simpson had gone in, and Phoebe's heart had begun to beat loudly in her throat, but it was not so easy to get rid of this ardent lover, and when at last he did go, he was slightly sulky, which was not a state of mind to be encouraged. She rushed upstairs to her grandmother's room, which was over the little room where Tozer sat, and from which she could already hear sounds of conversation rapidly rising in tone, and the noise of opening and shutting drawers and a general rummage. Phoebe never knew what she said to the kind old woman, who kissed and wept over her, exulting in the news. I ain't been so pleased since my Phoebe told me she was to marry a minister, said Mrs. Tozer, and this is a rise in life a deal grander than the best of ministers. But bless your heart, what shall I do without you? Cried the old woman, sobbing. Presently Tozer came in with an air of angry abstraction and began to search through drawers and boxes. I've lost something, he answered, with somber looks to his wife's inquiry. Phoebe busied herself with her grandmother and did not ask what it was. It was only when he had searched everywhere that some chance movement directed his eyes to her. She was trembling in spite of herself. He came up to her and seized her suddenly by the arm. By George, he cried, I'm in a dozen minds to search you. Tozer, let my child alone. How dare you touch her? Her as is as good as Mr. Copperhead's lady. What's she got to do with your dirty papers? Do you think Phoebe would touch them with a pair of tongs? Cried the angry grandmother. Phoebe shrank with all the cowardice of guilt. Her nerves were unstrung by weariness and excitement. And Tozer, with his little red eyes blazing upon her, was very different in this fury of personal injury from the grandfather of the morning, who had been ready to see every virtue in her. I believe as you've got it, he cried, giving her a shake. It was a shot at a venture, said without the least idea of the truth. But before the words had crossed his lips, he felt with a wild passion of rage and wonder that it was true. Give it up, you hussy, he shrieked, with a yell of fury, his face convulsed with sudden rage, thickly and with sputtering lips. Tozer, cried his wife, flinging herself between them, take your hands off the child. Run to your room, my darling. He's out of his senses. Lord bless us all, Sam. Are you gone stark staring mad? Grandpapa, said Phoebe, trembling, if I had it, you may be sure it would be safe out of your way. I told you I knew something about it, but you would not hear me. Will you hear me now? I'll make it up to you. Double it if you like. Grandmamma, it is a poor man he would drive to death if he is not stopped. Oh, cried Phoebe, clasping her hands. After what has happened this morning, will you not yield to me? And after all the love you have shown me? I will never ask anything, not another penny. I will make it up, only give in to me, for once in my life, Grandpapa. I never asked anything from you before. Give it up, you piece of impudence, you jade, you deceitful. He was holding her by the arm, emphasizing every new word by a violent shake, while poor old Mrs. Tozer dropped into a chair, weeping and trembling. Oh, it ain't often as he's like this, but when he is, I can't do nothing with him. I can't do nothing with him, she cried. But Phoebe's nerves strung themselves up again in face of the crisis. She shook him off suddenly with unexpected strength, and moving to a little distance, stood confronting him, pale but determined. If you think you will get the better of me in this way, you are mistaken, she said. I am not your daughter. How dare you treat me so? Grandmamma, forgive me. I have been up all night. I am going to lie down, said Phoebe. If Grandpapa has anything more to say against me, he can say it to Clarence. I leave myself in his hands. Saying this, she turned round majestically, but with an anxious heart, and walked away to her room, every nerve in her trembling. When she got there, Phoebe locked the door hastily, in genuine terror, and then she laughed, and then she cried a little. And to think it was here all the time, she said to herself, taking out the little Russia leather purse out of her pocket. She went into the closet adjoining her room and buried it deep in her traveling trunk, which was there, relieving herself and her mind of a danger. Then Phoebe did what was possibly the most sensible thing in the world, in every point of view. She went to bed, undressed herself quietly, rolled up her hair, and lay down with a grateful sense of ease and comfort. When Clarence comes back, he will be disappointed, but even for Clarence, a little disappointment will be no harm, said the sensible young woman to herself. And what comfort it was to lie down and feel all the throbs and pulses gradually subsiding, and fright going off, the satisfaction of success coming back, and gradually a slumberous, delicious ease stealing over her. Of all the clever things Phoebe had done in her life, it must be allowed that there was not one so masterly as the fact that she, then and there, went to sleep. All this had taken up a good deal of time. It was 12 when Mr. Simpson of the bank disturbed the lovers in the garden, and it was 1 o'clock before Phoebe put a stop to all Tozer's vindictive plans by going to bed. What he said to Mr. Simpson when he went back to him is not on record. That excellent man of business was much put out by the long waiting, and intimated plainly enough that he could not allow his time to be thus wasted. Mr. Simpson began to think that there was something very strange in the whole business. Tozer's house was turned upside down by it, and he could hear by the passionate voices and the sound of crying and storming in the room above. But Costine was secure in his shop, apparently fearing no evil, as he had seen as he passed, peering in with curious eyes. What it meant he could not tell, but it was queer, and did not look as if the business was straightforward. When you find the bill or make up your mind what to do, you can send for me, he said, and went away, suspicious and half angry, leaving Tozer to his own devices. And the afternoon passed in the most uncomfortable lull imaginable. Though he believed his granddaughter to have it, he looked again over all his papers, his drawers, his wastebasket, every corner he had in which such a small matter might have been hid, but naturally his search was all in vain. Clarence returned in the afternoon and was received by poor old Mrs. Tozer, very tremulous and ready to cry, who did not know whether she ought to distrust Phoebe or not, and hesitated and stumbled over her words till the young man thought his father had come in his absence, and that Phoebe had changed her mind. This had the effect of making him extremely eager and anxious, and of subduing the bragging and magnificent mood which the triumphant lover had displayed in the morning. He felt himself taken down a peg or two, in his own fine language. He went to the parsonage and tried very hard to see Ursula, to secure her help in case anything had gone wrong, and then to Reginald, whose vexation at the news he felt sure of and hoped to enjoy a sight of. But he could see no one in the absorbed and anxious house. What was he to do? He wandered about, growing more and more unhappy, wondering if he had been made to fling himself into the face of fate for no reason, and sure that he could not meet his father without Phoebe's support. He could not even face her relations. It was very different from the day of triumph he had looked for, but, as Phoebe had wisely divined, this disappointment and all the attending circumstances did not do him any harm. It was late in the afternoon when Northcote called. He too had acted on the information given by Betsy, and had gone to Cotstein, who made him vaguely aware that Tozer had some share in the business in which Mr. May was involved, and who, on being asked whether it could be set right by money, grew radiant and declared that nothing could be easier. But when Northcote saw Tozer, there ensued a puzzling game at cross purposes, for Tozer had no notion that Mr. May had anything to do with the business, and declined to understand. "I ain't got nothing to do with Parsons, and if you'll take my advice, sir, it'd be a deal better for you to give 'em up too. You're aggravating the connections for no good, you are," said Tozer, surely by right of his own troubles and perplexities, and glad to think he could make someone else uncomfortable too. "I shall do in that respect as I think proper," said Northcote, who was not disposed to submit to dictation. "Fact is, he's a deal too well off for a minister," Tozer said to his wife when the young man disappeared. "They're too independent, that sort, and I don't know what he means by his Mays and his fine folks. What have we got to do with Mr. May?" "Except that he's been good to the child, Tozer. We can't forget as he's been very good to the child." "Oh, dash the child!" cried the old man, infuriated. "If you say much more, I'll be sorry I ever let you see her face. What has she done with my bill?" "Bill? If it's only a bill, what are you so put out about?" cried Mrs. Tozer. "You'll have dozens again at Christmas, if that's all you want." But the laugh was unsuccessful, and the old man went back to his room to nurse his wrath and to wonder what had come to him. Why had his granddaughter interfered in his business, and what had he to do with Mr. May? Phoebe got up refreshed and comfortable when it was time for the family tea, and came down to her lover, who had come back, and was sitting very dejected by old Mrs. Tozer's side. She was fresh and fair, and in one of her prettiest dresses, having taken pains for him, and notwithstanding Tozer's lowering aspect, and his refusal to speak to her, the meal passed over very cheerfully for the rest of the party, and the two young people once more withdrew to the garden when it was over. The presence of Clarence Copperhead protected Phoebe from all attack. Her grandfather dared not fly out upon her as before, or summon her to give up what she had taken from him. Whatever happened, this wonderful rise in life, this grand match, could not be interfered with. He withdrew bitter and exasperated to his own den, leaving his poor wife crying and wretched in the family sitting-room. Mrs. Tozer knew that her husband was not to be trifled with, and that, though the circumstances of Phoebe's betrothal subdued him for the moment, this effect in all probability would not last, and she sat in terror, watching the moments as they passed, and trembling to think what might happen when the young pair came in again, or when Clarence at last went away, leaving Phoebe with no protection but herself. Phoebe, too, while she kept her dull companion happy, kept thinking all the while of the same thing with a great tremor of suppressed agitation in her mind, and she did not know what was the next step to take, a reflection which took away her strength. She had taken the bill from her trunk again and replaced it in her pocket. It was safest carried on her person, she felt. But what was she to do next? Even Phoebe, so fruitful in resources, could not say. When Northcote came back in the evening, she felt that her game was becoming more and more difficult to play. After a brief consultation with herself, she decided that it was most expedient to go in with him, taking her big bodyguard along with her, and confiding in his stupidity not to find out more than was indispensable. She took Northcote to her grandfather's room, whispering to him on the way to make himself the representative of Cotstein only, and to say nothing of Mr. May. "Then you know about it?" said Northcote, amazed. "Oh, hush, hush," cried Phoebe. "Offer to pay it on Cotstein's part, and say nothing about Mr. May." The young man looked at her bewildered, but nodded his head in assent, and then her own young man pulled her back almost roughly, and demanded to know what she meant by talking to that fellow so. Thus poor Phoebe was between two fires. She went in with a fainting yet courageous heart. "Pay the money," said Tozer, who by dint of brooding over it all day had come to a white heat, and was no longer to be controlled. "Mr. Northcote, sir, you're a minister, and you don't understand business no more nor women do. Money's money, but there's more than money here. There's my name, sir, as has been made use of in a way, me go signing of accommodation bills. I'd have cut off my hand sooner. There's that girl there, she's got it. She's been and stolen it from me, Mr. Northcote. Tell her to give it up. You may have some influence, you as is a minister. Tell her to give it up, or by George she shall never have a penny from me. I'll cut her off without even a shilling. I'll put her out of my will, out of my house." "I say, Phoebe," said Clarence, "look here, that's serious, that is. Not that I mind a little pot of money like what the poor old fellow's got, but what's the good of throwing anything away?" "Make her give it up," cried Tozer, hoarsely, "or out of this house she goes this very night. I ain't the sort of man to be made a fool of. I ain't the sort of man— Who's this a-comin'? Some more of your damned intercessors to spoil justice," cried the old man. "But I won't have 'em. I'll have nothing to say to them. What? Who? Mr. Copperhead's father? I ain't ashamed to meet Mr. Copperhead's father, but one thing at a time. Them as comes into my house must wait my time," cried the butterman, seeing vaguely the group come in, whom we left at his doors. "I'm master here. Give up that bill, you brazen young hussy, and go out of my sight. How dare you set up your face among so many men? Give it up," he cried, seizing her by the elbow in renewed fury. The strangers, though he saw them enter, received no salutation from him. There is one small lamp on the table, dimly lighted, which threw a faint glow upon the circle of countenances round, into which came wondering the burly big Copperhead, holding fast by the shoulder of Mr. May, whose ghastly face, contorted with wild anxiety, glanced at Tozer over the lamp. But the old man was so much absorbed at first that he scarcely saw who the newcomers were. "What's all this about?" said Mr. Copperhead. "Seems we've come into the midst of another commotion. So you're here, Clare. It is you I want, my boy. Look here, Northcote, take hold, will you? There's a screw loose, and we've got to get him home. Take hold till I have a word with Clarence. That's a thing that won't take long." Clarence cast a glance at Phoebe, who even in her own agitation turned and gave him a tremulous smile of encouragement. The crisis was so great on all sides of her that Phoebe became heroic. "I am here," she said, with all the steadiness of strong emotion, and when he had received this assurance of support, he feared his father no more. "All right, sir," he said almost with alacrity. He was afraid of nothing with Phoebe standing by. "Make her give up my bill," said Tozer. "I'll hear nothing else till this is settled. My bill. It's forgery, that's what it is. Don't speak to me about money. I'll have him punished. I'll have him rot in prison for it. I'll not cheat the law. You people as has influence with that girl, make her give it me. I can't touch him without the bill." Mr. May had been placed in a chair by the two young men who watched over him, but as Tozer spoke, he got up, struggling wildly, almost tearing himself out of the coat by which they held him. "Let me go," he said. "Do you hear him? Rot in prison, with hard labor? It would kill me. And it used to be hanging. My God, won't you let me go?" Tozer stopped short, stopped by this passion, which was greater than his own. He looked wonderingly at the livid face, the struggling figure, impressed in spite of himself. "He's gone mad," he said. "Good Lord, but he's got nothing to do with it. Can't you take him away?" "Grandpapa," said Phoebe in his ear, Here it is, your bill. It was he who did it, and it has driven him mad. Look, I give it up to you, and there he is. That is your work. Now do what you please." Trembling, the old man took the paper out of her hand. He gazed wondering at the other, who, somehow moved in his excitement by a sense that the decisive moment had come, stood still too, his arm half pulled out of his coat, his face wild with dread and horror. For a moment they looked at each other in a common agony, neither the one nor the other clear enough to understand, but both feeling that some tremendous crisis had come upon them. "He done it?" said Tozer, appalled and almost speechless. "He done it?" They all crowded round a circle of scared faces. Phoebe alone stood calm. She was the only one who knew the whole, except the culprit, who understood nothing with that mad confusion in his eyes. But he was overawed too, and in his very madness recognized the crisis. He stood still, struggling no longer, with his eyes fixed upon the homely figure of the old butterman, who stood trembling, thunderstruck, with that fatal piece of paper in his hand. Tozer had been mad for revenge 2 moments before, almost as wild as the guilty man before him, with a fierce desire to punish and make an example of the man who had wronged him. But this semi-madness was arrested by the sight of the other madman before him, and by the extraordinary shock of this revelation. It took all the strength out of him. He had not looked up to the clergyman as Cotstein did, but he had looked up to the gentleman, his customer, as being upon an elevation very different from his own, altogether above and beyond him, and the sight of this superior being, thus humbled, maddened, gazing at him with wild terror and agony more eloquent than any supplication, struck poor old Tozer to the very soul. "God help us all," he cried out with a broken, sobbing voice. He was but a vulgar old fellow, mean, it might be, worldly in his way, but the terrible mystery of human wickedness and guilt prostrated his common soul with as sharp an anguish of pity and shame as could have befallen the most heroic. It seized upon him so that he could not say or do nothing more, forcing hot and salt tears into his old eyes, and shaking him all over with a tremor as of palsy. The scared faces appeared to come closer to Phoebe, to whom these moments seemed like years. Had her trust been vain? Softly, but with an excitement beyond control, she touched him on the arm. "That's true," said Tozer, half crying. "Something's got to be done. We can't all stand here forever, Phoebe. It's him as ought to be thought of. Show it to him, poor gentleman, if he ain't past knowing, and burn it, and let us hear of it no more." Solemnly, in the midst of them all, Phoebe held up the paper before the eyes of the guilty man. If he understood it or not, no one could tell. He did not move, but stared blankly at her and it. Then she held it over the lamp and let it blaze and drop into harmless ashes in the midst of them all. Tozer dropped down into his elbow chair, sniffling and sobbing. Mr. May stood quite still, with a look of utter dullness and stupidity coming over the face in which so much terror had been. If he understood what had passed, it was only in feeling, not in intelligence. He grew still and dull in the midst of that strange madness, which all the time was only half madness, a mixture of conscious excitement and anxiety with that which passes the boundaries of consciousness. For the moment he was stilled into stupid idiocy, and looked at them with vacant eyes. As for the others, Northcote was the only one who divined at all what this scene meant. To Reginald it was like a scene in a pantomime, bewildering dumb show, with no sense or meaning in it. It was he who spoke first, with a certain impatience of the occurrence which he did not understand. "Will you come home, sir, now?" he said. "Come home, for heaven's sake. Northcote will give you an arm. He's very ill," Reginald added, looking around him pitifully in his ignorance. "What you are thinking of I can't tell, but he's ill and delirious. It was Mr. Copperhead who brought him here against my will. Excuse me, Miss Beecham. Now I must take him home." "Yes," said Phoebe. The tears came into her eyes as she looked at him. He was not thinking of her at the moment, but she knew he had thought of her much and tenderly, and she felt that she might never see him again. Phoebe would have liked him to know what she had done, and to know that what she had done was for him chiefly, in order to recompense him a little, poor fellow, for the heart he had given her, which she could not accept, yet could not be ungrateful for. And yet she was glad, though there was a pang in it, that he should never know and remain unaware of her effort for his own sake. But the tears came into her eyes as she looked at him, and he caught the gleam of the moisture which made his heart beat. Something moved her beyond what he knew of, and his heart thrilled with tenderness and wonder. But how should he know what it was? "Give my love to Ursula," she said. "I shall not come tonight, as she has a nurse, and I think he will be better. Make her rest, Mr. May, and if I don't see her, say goodbye to her for me." "Goodbye?" "Yes, goodbye. Things have happened. Tell her I hope she will not forget me," said Phoebe, with tears dropping down her cheeks. "But oh, never mind me. Look at him. He is quite quiet. He is worn out. Take him home." "There is nothing else to be done," said poor Reginald, whose heart began to ache with a sense of the unknown which surrounded him on every side. He took his father by the arm, who had been standing quite silent, motionless, and apathetic. He had no need for any help, for Mr. May went with him at a touch, as docile as a child. Northcote followed with grave looks and very sad. Tozer had been seated in his favorite chair, much subdued, and giving vent now and then to something like a sob. His nerves had been terribly shaken. But as he saw the three gentlemen going away, nature awoke in the old butterman. He put out his hand and plucked Northcote by the sleeve. "I'll not say no to that money, not now, Mr. Northcote, sir," he said. End of chapter 43, read by Brize Cries, Youngstown.
Chapter 44 of Phoebe Junior. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by AshleyM. Phoebe Junior by Margaret O. Oliphant. Phoebe's Last Trial. "Now, if you please," said Mr. Copperhead, "I think it's my turn. I wanted May to hear what I had got to say, but as he's ill or mad or something, it is not much good. I can't imagine what all these incantations meant, and all your play, Miss Phoebe, eyes and all. That sort of thing don't suit us plain folks. If you don't mind following your friends, I want to speak to old Tozer here by himself. I don't like to have women meddling in my affairs." "Grandpa is very tired and he is upset," said Phoebe. "I don't think he can have any more said to him tonight." "By George, but he shall, though, and you too. Look here," said Mr. Copperhead. "You've taken in my boy Clarence here. He's been a fool, and he always was a fool. But you're not a fool, Miss Phoebe. You know precious well what you're about. And just you listen to me. He shan't marry you, not if he breaks his heart over it. I ain't a man that thinks much of breaking hearts. You and he may talk what nonsense you like, but you shan't marry my boy. No, not if there wasn't another woman in the world." "He has asked me," said Phoebe, "but I certainly did not ask him." "You must give your orders to your son, Mr. Copperhead. You have no right to dictate to me. Grandpapa, I think you and I have had enough for tonight." With this, Phoebe began to close the shutters, which had been left open, and to put away books and things which were lying about. Tozer made a feeble attempt to stop her energetic proceedings. "Talk to the gentleman, Phoebe, if Mr. Copperhead has anything to say to you. Don't you go and offend him, my dear," the old man cried in an anxious whisper, and then he raised himself from the chair in which he had sunk exhausted by the unusual commotions to which he had been subjected. "I am sure, sir," Tozer began, "it ain't my wish, nor the wish of my family, to do anything as is against your wishes." "Grandpapa," said Phoebe, interrupting him ruthlessly, "Mr. Copperhead's wishes may be a rule to his own family, but they are not to be a rule to yours. For my part, I won't submit to it. Let him take his son away if he pleases, or if he can," she added, turning round upon Clarence with a smile. "Mr. Clarence Copperhead is as free as I am to go or to stay." "By Jove!" cried that young man, who had been hanging in the background, dark and miserable. He came close up to her, and caught first her sleeve and then her elbow. The contact seemed to give him strength. "Look here, sir, he said ingratiatingly. "We don't want to offend you. I don't want to fly in your face. But I can't go on having coaches forever. And here's the only one in the world that can do the business instead of coaches. Phoebe knows I'm fond of her, but that's neither here nor there. Here is the one that can make something of me. I ain't clever, you know it as well as I do, but she is. I don't mind going into Parliament, making speeches and that sort of thing, if I've got her to back me up. But without her, I'll never do anything. Without her, you may put me in a cupboard, as you've often said. Let me have her, and I'll make a figure and do you credit. I can't say any fairer," said Clarence, taking the rest of her arm into his grasp and holding her hand. He was stupid, but he was a man, and Phoebe felt proud of him, for the moment at least. "You idiot," cried his father, "and I was an idiot too to put any faith in you. Come away from that artful girl. Can't you see that it's all a made-up plan from beginning to end? What was she sent down here for but to catch you, you oaf, you fool you? Drop her, or you drop me. That's all I've got to say." "Yes, drop me, Clarence," said Phoebe with a smile, "for in the meantime you hurt me. See, you have bruised my arm. While you settle this question with your father, I will go to Grandmamma. Pardon me, I take more interest in her than in this discussion between him and you." "You shan't go," cried her lover. "Not a step. Look here, sir, if that's what it comes to, her before you. What you've made of me ain't much, is it? But I don't mind what I go in for, as long as she's to the fore. Her before you." "Is that your last word?" said Mr. Copperhead. "Yes." His son faced him with a face as set and cloudy as his own. The mouth, shut close and sullen, was the same in both, but those brown eyes which Clarence got from his mother, and which were usually mild in their expression, looking out gently from the ruder face to which they did not seem to belong, were now not clear, but muddy with resolution, glimmering with dogged obstinacy from under the drooping eyelids. He was not like himself. He was as he had been that day when Mr. May saw him at the Dorsets, determined, more than a match for his father, who had only the obstinacy of his own nature, not that dead resisting force of two people to bring to the battle. Clarence had all the pertinacity that was not in his mother to reinforce his own. Mr. Copperhead stared at his son with that look of authority, half imperious, half brutal, with which he was in the habit of crushing all who resisted him. But Clarence did not quail. He stood dull and immovable, his eyes contracted, his face stolid, and void of all expression but that of resistance. He was not much more than a fool, but just by so much as his father was more reasonable, more clear-sighted than himself, was Clarence stronger than his father. He held Phoebe by the sleeve, that she might not escape him, but he faced Mr. Copperhead with a dull determination that all the powers of earth could not shake. For the moment, the father lost his self-control. "Then I'll go," he said, "and when you've changed your mind, you can come to me, but—" Here he swore a big oath. "Mind what you're about. There never was a man yet but repented when he set himself against me." Clarence made no answer. Talking was not in his way, and Mr. Copperhead showed his wondering apprehension of a power superior to his own by making a pause after he had said this, and not going away directly. He stopped, and tried once more to influence the rebel with that stare. "Phoebe, Phoebe, for God's sake, make him give in, and don't go against Mr. Copperhead," cried Tozer's tremulous voice, shaken with weakness and anxiety. But Phoebe did not say anything. She felt in the hesitation, the pause, the despairing last effort to conquer, that the time of her triumph had nearly come. When he went away, they all stood still and listened to his footsteps going along the passage and through the garden. When he was outside, he paused again, evidently with the idea of returning, but changed his mind and went on. To be left like this, the victors on a field of domestic conflict, is very often not at all a triumphant feeling, and involves a sense of defeat about as bad as the reality experienced by the vanquished. Phoebe, who was imaginative and had lively feeling, felt a cold shiver go over her as the steps went away, one by one, and began to cry softly, not knowing quite why it was. But Clarence, who had no imagination, nor any feelings to speak of, was at his ease and perfectly calm. "What are you crying for?" he said. "The governor can do what he likes. I'd marry you in spite of 100 like him. He didn't know what he was about, didn't the governor, when he tackled me." "But, Clarence, you must not break with your father. You must not quarrel on my account." "That's as it may be," he said. "Never you mind. When it's cleverness that's wanted, it's you that's wanted to back me up. But I can stick to my own way without you. And my way is this. he said, suddenly lifting her from the ground, holding her waist between his two big hands and giving her an emphatic kiss. Phoebe was silenced altogether when this had happened. He was a blockhead, but he was a man and could stand up for his love, and for his own rights as a man, independent of the world. She felt a genuine admiration for her lout at that moment, but this admiration was accompanied by a very chill sense of all that might be forfeited if Mr. Copperhead stood out. Clarence, poor and disowned by his father, would be a very different person from the Clarence Copperhead who was going into Parliament and had a fine position in prospect. She did not form any resolutions as to what she would do in that case, for she was incapable of anything dishonourable, but it made her shiver as with a cold icy current running over. And as for poor old Tozer, he was all but whimpering in his chair. "Oh Lord," he cried, "a great man like Mr. Copperhead, affronted in my humble house. It's what I never thought to see. A friend of the connection like that, your father's leading member. Oh, Phoebe, it was an evil day has brought you here to make all this mischief. And if I had known what was going on," cried Tozer, almost weeping in his despair. "You are tired, Grandpapa," said Phoebe. "Don't be frightened about us. Mr. Copperhead is very fond of Clarence, and he will give in. Or if he doesn't give in, still, we shall not be worse off than many other people." But she said this with a secret panic devouring her soul, wondering if it was possible that such a horrible revolution of circumstances and change of everything she had looked for could be. Even Clarence was silenced, though immovable. He went away soon after, and betook himself to his room at the parsonage, where all his possessions still were, while Phoebe attended upon her grandmother, whose agitation and fear she calmed without saying much. Tozer, quite broken down, retired to bed, and when they were all disposed of, Phoebe went out to the garden and made a mournful little promenade there, with very serious thoughts. If Clarence was to be cast off by his father, what could she do with him? It was not in Phoebe to abandon the stupid lover who had stood up so manfully for her. No, she must accept her fate however the balance turned. But if this dreadful change happened, what should she do with him? The question penetrated and made her shiver to the depths of her soul, but never even in imagination did she forsake him. He was hers now, come good or ill. But the prospect of the ill was appalling to her. She went up and down the garden path, slowly in the silence, looking up to the stars, with her heart very full. Phoebe felt that no usual burden had been put upon her. Last night her occupation had been one of the purest charity, and this Providence had seemed to recompense in the morning by dropping at her very feet the prize she had long meant to win. But now she was down again, after being lifted up so high, and a great part of its value was taken out of that prize. Was she mercenary or worldly minded in her choice? It would be hard to say so, for she never questioned with herself whether or not she should follow Clarence into obscurity and poverty, if things should turn out so. She would never abandon him, however bad his case might be, but her heart sunk very low when she thought of her future with him, without the career which would have made everything sweet. Mr. Copperhead, too, had very serious thoughts on this subject, and sat up long, drinking brandy and water, and knitting his brows, as he turned the subject over and over in his mind, recognising with disgust, in which, nevertheless, there mingled a certain respect, that Clarence would not yield. He was as obstinate as himself, or more so. He had gone to the inn where he was alone, without any of his usual comforts. It was perhaps the first time in his prosperous life that he had ever been really crossed. Joe had never attempted to do it, nor any of the first family. They had married as they had done everything else according to his dictation, and now here was his useless son, his exotic plant, his Dresden china, not only asserting a will of his own, but meaning to have it, and showing a resolution, a determination equal to his own. His mother had never shown anything of this. She had yielded, as everyone else had yielded, Mr. Copperhead reflected, to whatever he ordered. Where had the boy got this unsuspected strength? A kind of smile broke unawares over the rich man's face as he asked himself this question, a smile which he chased away with a frown, but which nevertheless had been there for a moment, roused by a subtle suggestion of self-flattery. Where but from himself had his gentleman's son, as the millionaire proudly held him to be, got that strength of obstinacy? He chased the thought and the smile away with a frown, and went to bed gloomily nursing his wrath, but yet this suggestion which he himself had made was more flattering to himself than words can say. As for Clarence, the only other person deeply concerned, after he had asked for Mr. May and expressed his regret to learn how ill he was, the young man smoked a cigar on the doorsteps and then went peaceably, without either care or anxiety, to bed, where he slept very soundly till 8 o'clock next morning, which was the hour at which he was called, though he did not always get up. When Mr. Copperhead began the new day, he began it with a very unwise idea, quickly carried out, as unwise ideas generally are. Feeling that he could make nothing of his son, he resolved to try what he could make of Phoebe, a young woman, nay, a bit of a girl, not more than 20, and a minister's daughter, brought up in reverence of the leading member. Any resistance on her part seemed really incredible. He could not contemplate the idea of giving up all the cherished plans of his life by a melodramatic renunciation of his son. To give up Clarence, whom he had trained to be the very apex and crowning point of his grandeur, was intolerable to him. But Mr. Copperhead had heard before now of young women who, goaded to it, have been known to give up their lover rather than let their lover suffer on their account. And if this had ever been the case, surely it might be so in the present instance. Had he not the comfort of the Beecham family in his hands? Could he not make the Crescent Chapel too hot to hold them? Could he not awaken the fears of scores of other fathers, very unlikely to permit their favourite sons to stray into the hands of pastors' daughters? There was nothing indeed to be said against Mr. Beecham, but still it would be strange if Mr. Copperhead, out and away the richest man in the community, could not make the Crescent too hot to hold him. He went down the lane from the George, where he had slept quite early next morning, with this purpose full in his head, and, as good luck, he thought, would have it, found Phoebe, who had been restless all night with anxiety, and had got up early, once more walking up and down the long garden path, reflecting over all that had happened, and wondering as to what might happen still. What a piece of luck it was! He was accustomed to have fortune on his side, and it seemed natural to him. He went up to her with scarcely a pause for the usual salutations, and plunged at once into what he had to say. "Miss Phoebe, I am glad to find you alone. I wanted a word with you," he said, "about the affair of last night. Why shouldn't you and I, the only two sensible ones in the business, settle it between ourselves? Old Tozer is an old ass, begging your pardon for saying so, and my son is a fool." "I do not agree to either," said Phoebe gravely. "But never mind, I will certainly hear what you have to say." "What I have to say is this. I will never consent to let my son Clarence marry you." Here he was interrupted by a serious little bow of assent from Phoebe, which disconcerted and angered him strangely. "This being the case," he resumed more hotly, "don't you think we'd better come to terms, you and me? You are too sensible a girl, I'll be bound, to marry a man without a penny, which is what he would be. He would be properly made an end of, Miss Phoebe, if he found out, after all his bravado last night, that you were the one to cast him off after all." "He cannot find that out," said Phoebe with a smile. "Unfortunately, even if I could have done it under brighter circumstances, my mouth is closed now. I desert him now when he is in trouble. Of course you do not know me, so you are excused for thinking so, Mr. Copperhead." The rich man stared. She was speaking a language which he did not understand. "Look here, Miss Phoebe," he said. "Let's understand each other. High horses don't answer with me. As for deserting him when he's in trouble, if you'll give him up, or desert him as you call it, he need never be in trouble at all. You can stop all that. Just you say no to him, and he'll soon be on his knees to me to think no more of it." "You know who I am," Mr. Copperhead continued with a concealed threat. "I have a deal of influence in the connection, though I say it that shouldn't, and I'm very well looked on in chapel business. What would the Crescent do without me? And if there should be an unpleasantness between the minister and the leading member, why, you know, Miss Phoebe, no one better who it is that would go to the wall." She made no answer, and he thought she was impressed by his arguments. He went on still more strongly than before. "Such a clever girl as you knows all that," said Mr. Copperhead, "and suppose you were to marry Clarence without a penny. What would become of you? What would you make of him? He is too lazy for hard work, and he has not brains enough for anything else. What would you make of him if you had him? That's what I want to know." "And that is just what I can't tell you," said Phoebe, smiling. "It is a very serious question. I suppose something will turn up." "What can turn up? You marry him because he is going into Parliament, and could give you a fine position." "I confess," said Phoebe with her usual frankness, that I did think of his career. Without that, the future is much darker and rather depressing. Yes, you see that. A poor clod of a fellow that can't work, and will be hanging upon you every day, keeping you from working, that you will never be able to make anything of. Mr. Copperhead, said Phoebe sweetly, why do you tell all this to me? Your mere good sense will show you that I cannot budge. I have accepted him being rich, and I cannot throw him over when he is poor. I may not like it, I don't like it, but I am helpless. Whatever change is made, it cannot be made by me. He stared at her in blank wonder and dismay. For a moment he could not say anything. Look here, he faltered at last. You thought him a great match, a rise in the world for you and yours. But he ain't a great match any longer. What's the use then of keeping up the farce? You and me understand each other. You've nothing to do but let him off. You're young and pretty, you'll easily find someone else. Fools are plenty in this world, he added, unable to refrain from that one fling. Let him off and all will be right. What's to prevent you? I'd not lose a moment if I were you. Phoebe laughed. She had a pretty laugh, soft yet ringing like a child's. You and I fear, are no rule for each other, she said. Mr. Copperhead, what prevents me is a small thing called honour. That is all. Honour? That's for men, he said hastily, and folly for them, according as you mean it. But for women, there's no such thing. It's sham and humbug. And look you here, Miss Phoebe, he continued, losing his temper. You see what your father will say to this when you get him into hot water with his people. There's more men with sons than me, and if the crescent ain't too hot to hold him within a month, do you think I'll stand it, a beggarly minister and his belongings, coming in the way of a man that could buy you all up 20 times over and more? The fury into which he had worked himself took away Mr. Copperhead's breath. Phoebe said nothing. She went on by his side with soft steps, her face a little downcast, the suspicion of a smile about her mouth. By George, he cried when he had recovered himself. You think you can laugh at me. You think you can defy me. You, a bit of a girl as poor as Job. I defy no one, said Phoebe. I cannot prevent you from insulting me, that is all, which is rather hard, she added with a smile, which cost her an effort, seeing that I shall have to drag your son through the world somehow, now that you have cast him off. He will not give me up, I know, and honour prevents me from giving him up, so I shall have hard work enough without any insults from you. It is a pity, said Phoebe, with a sort of sympathetic regret for herself so badly used. I could have made a man of him. I could have backed him up to get on as well as most men, but it will certainly be uphill work now. She did not look at the furious father as she spoke. She was quite calm, treating it reflectively, regretfully, as a thing past and over. Mr. Copperhead tried to burst forth again in threats and objurgations, but in spite of himself, and though she never said another word, the big, rich, noisy man was silenced. He went away, threatening to appeal to her father, which Phoebe, with a last effort, begged him smilingly to do. But this was the last of which she was capable. When she had closed the door after him, she rushed upstairs to her room and cried bitterly. Everything was very dark to her. If he did appeal to her father, the appeal would spread confusion and dismay through the pastor's heart and family. And what was to become of herself, with Clarence on her hands, who could do nothing that was useful, and could earn neither his own living nor hers? All this was very terrible to Phoebe, and for a moment she contemplated the unheard-of step of having a headache and staying upstairs. But she reflected that her poor old grandfather had done his duty at no small sacrifice, according to her bidding yesterday, and she bathed her eyes heroically, and collected her strength, and went down to breakfast as usual. It was her duty, which she must do. As for Mr. Copperhead, he took a long walk, to reflect upon all the circumstances which were complicated enough to cause him much trouble. He could not give up his cherished scheme, his Member of Parliament, his crown of glory. It was what he had been looking forward to for years. He tried to realise the failure of his hopes, and could not, nay, would not, feeling it more than he could bear. No, without his gentleman's son, his university man, his costly, useless production, who was worth so much money to him, yet brought in nothing. He felt that he must shrink in the opinion of all his friends, even of his own sons, the first family, who had so envied, sneered at, undervalued Clarence, yet had been forced to be civil to him, and respect their father's imperious will, as he chose that it should be respected. What a sorry figure he should cut before all of them if he cast off Clarence, and had to announce himself publicly as foiled in all his plans and hopes. He could not face this prospect. He shrank from it as if it had involved actual bodily pain. The men who would laugh at his failure were men of his own class, to whom he had bragged at his ease, crowing and exulting over them, and he felt that he could not face them if all his grand anticipations collapsed. There was nothing for it but to give in. And on the other hand, this girl Phoebe was a very clever girl, able not only to save the expense of coaches, but to cram the boy and keep him up better than any coach could do. She could make his speeches for him, like enough, Mr. Copperhead thought, and a great many reasons might be given to the world why she had been chosen instead of a richer wife for the golden boy. Golden girls, as a general rule, were not of so much use. Fortune ain't worth thinking of in comparison with brains. It was brains I wanted, and I've bought 'em dear, but I hope I can afford it, he almost heard himself saying, to an admiring, envious assembly. For Mr. Copperhead so far deserved his success that he could accept a defeat when it was necessary, and make the best of it. When he had nearly ended his walk, and had reached in his thoughts to this point, he met his son, who was walking up from the parsonage to number 6 in the lane. Clarence looked cheerful enough as he walked along, whistling under his breath, towards his love. But when he saw his father, a change came over his face. Once more his eyelids drooped over his eyes, and those muddy brown orbs got fixed in dull obstinacy. Once more his upper lip shut down sullen and fast upon the lower. The entire expression of his face changed. Mr. Copperhead saw this afar off, from the moment his son perceived him, and the sight gave to all his thinking that force which reality gives to imagination. The risk he was running became doubly clear. "Good morning, Clarence," he said. "Good morning, sir," responded the other, with lowering brows and close-shut mouth. "I suppose you were coming to the George to me. Come along, I've had no breakfast, and let's hope, my boy, that you're in a better mind than last night." "Look here, sir," said Clarence, "you might as well ask one of those houses to walk with you to the George, and show a better mind." "I'm of one mind, and one only. I'll marry Phoebe Beecham, whether you like it or not, and no other woman in this world." "Is that your last word?" said the father, curiously repeating, without being aware of it, his question of the previous night. "That's my last word," said the son, contemplating his father sullenly from under the heavy lids of his obstinate eyes. "Very well," said Mr. Copperhead, "then come along to breakfast, for I'm hungry, and we can talk it over there." End of chapter 44.
Chapter 45 of Phoebe Junior. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by littlemissclumsy. Phoebe Junior by Margaret O. Oliphant. Chapter 45. The Last. This is how Phoebe's difficulties ended. Contrary to her every expectation, Mr. Copperhead made a great brag of her powers wherever he went. "Money is money," he said, "but brains is brains all the same. We can't get on without them. And when you want to make a figure in the world, sir, buy a few brains if they fall in your way. That's my style. I've done with stupid ones up till now, but when I see there's a want of a clever one, I ain't such a fool as to shut my eyes to it. They cost dear, but I'm thankful to say I can afford that, aye, and a good deal more." Thus everything was satisfactorily arranged. Toza and his wife cried together for joy on the wedding day, but they did not expect to be asked to that ceremony, being well aware that Phoebe, having now completely entered into the regions of the great, could not be expected to have very much to say to them. "Though I know the darling, as she'd just be the same if she was here, and wouldn't let nobody look down upon you and me," said the old woman. "She's a wonderful girl, she is," said old Toza. "Wind us all around her little finger, that's what she could do, leastways, except when there was principle in it, and there I stood firm. But I've done things for Phoebe as I wouldn't have done for no other breathing, and she knew it. I wouldn't give in to her, though, about church folks being just as good as them as is more enlightened. That's again reason, but I've done things for him along of her. Ah, she's a wonderful girl, is Phoebe. Phoebe Junior, as I always call her. There ain't her match between here and London, and that's what I'll always say. But we will not try to describe the glory and joy that filled Mr. Beecham's house in the terrace when Mrs. Clarence Copperhead went back there with all their friends to the wedding breakfast, which was in the very best style and regardless of expense. Even at that moment it gave Phoebe a little pang to see her mother in the bright colours which she loved, but which made her so much pinker and fatter than was needful. Little Mrs. Copperhead, in dim neutral tints, looked like a little shadow beside the pastor's buxom wife, and was frightened and ill at ease and sad to the heart to lose her boy, who had been all she possessed in the world. Sophie Dorset, specially asked for the purpose with Ursula May, who was a bridesmaid, looked on with much admiration at the curious people, so rich, so fine, and so overwhelming, among whom her father had found it so remarkable to meet not one person whom he knew. "Now, Ursula," she said, "if you had played your cards properly, that beautiful bridegroom, and that nice little house in Mayfair, and the privilege, perhaps, of writing M.P. after your name some time or other, might all have been yours instead of Miss Beecham's. Why did you let her carry off the prize?" "Cousin Sophie!" cried Ursula indignantly. "As if I ever thought of him as a prize! But I know you are only laughing at me. The strange thing is that she likes him, though I am sure she knew very well that Reginald— Oh, when one thinks how many people there are in this world who do not get what they wish most, and how many people there are— Ursula paused, involved in her own antithesis, and Sophie ended it for her with a sigh. "Who do, and the one is no happier than the other most times, little Ursula. But you don't understand that, and as you are going to be one of the blessed ones, you need not take to making reflections. That is my privilege, my dear." "Oh, Cousin Sophie, why were not you one of those blessed ones too?" cried Ursula, clasping her arms suddenly round her kind friend. This, be it understood, was after the breakfast was over, and when, in the deep gloom which generally concludes a wedding day, everybody had gone home. The two were in a magnificent large bed-chamber in Portland Place, in the vast silent mansion of the Copperheads, where at present there was nothing more cheerful than the bridegroom's soft-eyed mother taking herself dreadfully to task for not being happy, and trying not to cry, though there was to be a great dinner and entertainment that night. "Don't you know," said Sophie, putting her aside with a certain proud coldness and a momentary laugh, "he I loved proved false. That is to say, in simple language, he turned out so poor a creature that it is very good of me not to despise humanity for his sweet sake. Never mind. If all had gone well, and he had been a real man instead of the sham image of one, I don't suppose I should have ever been among the blessed ones. Annise, who never thought of such mysteries at all. And so you will be, my little Ursula, very happy. I am sure of it. Though how you can manage to be happy, my dear, marrying a man who is not a good churchman, it is not for me to say." "Cousin Sophie, have I been brought up in a way to make me so fond of churchmen?" said Ursula solemnly. She could not have told how much or how little she knew about her father's behaviour and the shock to his mental system, but vaguely and by instinct there was a great deal that she did know. "You have been behind the scenes too much, perhaps," said Sophie Dorset, shrugging her shoulders. "But don't think any worse of the world than you ought, if you can't think very much better. No class is good or bad, Ursula. Men are but men all over the world. This made Ursula cry, though it is difficult to say why. She thought it cynical, and probably so will the reader. Perhaps Sophie Dorset abandoned the cause of mankind too easily, as most people of her temperament and age are disposed to do. Anyhow, the evening entertainment took place and was very fine, and every honour was done to Clarence Copperhead's marriage, especially by his mother, who appeared in the most lovely satin that eyes ever saw, and diamonds, and almost succeeded all the evening in keeping herself from crying, but not entirely. She did break down when the health of bridegroom and bride was drunk as it ought to be, but recovered herself hastily when the mother on the other side gave her a kiss of sympathy. Though it was an honest kiss, it filled poor little Mrs. Copperhead's mind with the most unchristian feelings, and gave her strength to keep up for the rest of the evening, and do her duty to the last. Nevertheless, Phoebe was the best of daughters-in-law, and ended by making her husband's mother dependent on her for most of the comforts of her life. And Clarence got into Parliament, and the reader, perhaps, if Parliament is sitting, may have had the luck to read a speech in the morning paper of Phoebe's composition. And if he ever got the secret of her style, would know it again, and might trace the course of a public character for years to come by that means. But this secret is one which no bribe nor worldly inducement will ever tempt our lips to betray. Northcote was released from the charge of Salem Chapel directly after these events, by the return of the minister safe and sound from his holiday, to the great delight of the congregation, though they had not been very fond of their old pastor before. Now they could not sufficiently exult over the happy reinstalment. "The other one never crossed our doors from the day he came till now as he's going away," said one indignant member, "nor took no more notice of us chapel folks, nor if we were dirt beneath his feet." That time as the meeting was held when he spoke up against the sinecure was the only time as my mind was satisfied, cried another, and a deal came of it after, making friends with the very man he had abused. "All his friends was church folks," said a third. "He was a wolf in sheep's clothing, that's what I calls him, and a poor moralist as a preacher, with never a rising word in them things as he called his sermons. We're well rid of the likes of him, though he may be clever. I don't give much for that kind of cleverness. And what's the good of you, minister or not minister, if you can't keep consistent and stick to your own side?" The chorus was so strong that the echo of it moved Tozer, who was a kind of archdeacon and leading member too, in his way, where he sat twiddling his thumbs in his little room. "I'm one as is qualified to give what you may call a casting vote," said Tozer, "being the oldest deacon in Salem, and one as has seen generations coming and going. And as for church and chapel, I've served them both, and seen the colour of their money. And there's them as has their obligations to me, though we needn't name no names. But this I will say, as I'm cured of clever men and them as is thought superior. They ain't to be calculated upon. If any more of them young intellectuals turns up at Carlingford, I'll tell him right out, 'You ain't the man for my money.' I'll say to him as bold as brass, 'I've been young, and now I'm old, and it's my conviction as clever young men ain't the sort for Salem. We want them as is steady going, and them as is consistent. Good, strong opinions, and none of your charity. That's what we wants here.'" Now, Tozer had loved clever young men in his day more well than wisely, as everybody knew, and this deliverance carried all the more weight in consequence, and was echoed loudly by one general hum of content and applause. Northcote took this very quietly, but he retired after he had married Ursula from the office of pastor, for which he was not fitted, and from the Liberation Society and various other societies, coming to see that this establishment was not a panacea for national evils any more than other things. He was in the habit of quoting his brother-in-law, Reginald May, as the best man he knew, but this did not make him a churchman, for naturally he could not say the same of other members of the same class and family. He was shaken out of his strong opinions, but it is doubtful how far this was good for him, for he was a man of warlike disposition, and not to have something which he could go to the stake for, something which he could think the devil's own stronghold to assail, was a drawback to him, and cramped his mental development. But he was happy in his home with his pretty Ursula, which is probably all the reader will care to know. He paid towards us £150, and he made no inquiries, and tried not to ask himself what all that strange scene had meant, and whatever it did mean, it was over for ever, and nobody asked any further questions or made any revelations on the subject. As for Mr. May, his mysterious illness went on for some time, the doctors never venturing to put any name to it. It was mental shock, and perhaps aberration, though he was sane enough to calm down after that incomprehensible scene. Mr. Simpson of the bank had a good guess at the secret of the enigma, but even Tozer got easy about it after a while, and though he knew that he had done Mr. May a wonderful service, could scarcely have told what it was. And neither, when it was all over, could the culprit have told. He got better and worse for about a year, and then he died, his strength failing him without any distinct reason, no one could tell how. Reginald got the living and stepped into his father's place, making a home for the children, which sharp Janie rules over, not so softly or steadily as Ursula, with a love of theories and experiments not quite consistent with the higher graces of housekeeping, yet with an honest meaning through it all. As the times are so unsettled, and no one can tell what may become within a year of any old foundations, the trustees have requested Reginald to retain his chaplaincy at the old college, so that he is, in reality, a pluralist and almost rich, though, they say, the hardest worked man in Carlingford. He has his vagaries too, which no man can live without, but he is the kindest guardian to his brothers and sisters, and bears with Jenny's freaks with exemplary gentleness. And he has a curate, whom in the course of nature Jenny will probably marry, though this has not yet been revealed to either party, who have reached only the first stage of hating each other up to this time. It is not thought in the family that Reginald will ever marry. She was never worthy of him, the sisters say, but he thinks differently, as yet at least. However, he is young, and things may mend. End of chapter 45, and end of Phoebe Junior by Margaret O. Oliphant.